In all my years as a forensics officer, I thought I had seen it all. Massacres, serial murders, dismembered bodies. But nothing prepared me for what I found in that damned village. Mackenzie Bridge. The name sounds like a peaceful place, doesn't it? However, what hid in the shadows of that place was not of this world. What I saw, what I discovered, haunts me to this day. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I'm a forensics agent for the FBI. In 1992, at the age of 35, I believed I had already witnessed the most extreme horrors anyone could imagine in my career. My work took me to scenes so terrible that they became recurring nightmares. Mutilated bodies, senseless massacres, crimes so vicious that they kept me awake for weeks. But none of this prepared me for what I found at Mackenzie Bridge. Mackenzie Bridge was a small village lost in the northwest of the country, so remote that it seemed frozen in time, as if it had been trapped in the 1950s. The wooden houses creaked with every gust of wind, and the deserted streets made me wonder if anyone still lived there. From the first moment, something about that place made me shiver. It seemed to be a village where everyone knew everyone and where strangers were not welcome. I was sent there for a specific purpose, to investigate a series of deaths that defied any logical explanation, and that had begun to attract the government's attention. Before the media or state authorities got involved, the FBI wanted to solve the case discreetly, and I was chosen to do the dirty work. With my background, they knew I wouldn't hesitate to go all the way to find out the truth. From the beginning, something seemed out of the ordinary. The deaths were too strange, with details so specific that they could not be the work of an ordinary serial killer. My instinct told me I was about to discover something that should never have been unearthed. As soon as I arrived at the village and got out of my vehicle, I saw several local police officers in the distance cordoning off an area in the forest. I quickly approached them, and the expression on their faces showed the usual mixture of confusion and revulsion, a common reaction to what lay ahead. Sheriff Don, a burly man with a hat that appeared to be part of his body, met me before I crossed the perimeter. "You have nothing to do here, Agent. This case belongs to us, and I would prefer if you let us do our job," he said, his voice filled with authority, yet tinged with insecurity. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered resistance. I looked him straight in the eye and, without changing my tone, replied, "If they were doing their job right, I wouldn't be here." The sheriff frowned but didn't respond. He knew I was right, and that only increased his irritation. I walked under the police tape and approached the body lying on the ground. The place was permeated with the smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic, a combination that always portended the worst. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no sounds from the forest, as if everything around us had been frozen in time. The corpse was that of a young man, lying on his back on a peculiar terrain. Around the body, the earth was scorched, forming a perfect circle that contrasted with the untouched vegetation around it. There were no signs of struggle or visible injuries, just the inexplicable mark on the ground and the blank look of the corpse, which seemed to have died in an instant of pure terror. I took out my camera and started photographing the scene, recording every detail. The more I watched, the more the feeling that something supernatural was involved grew within me. It was as if that place was permeated by an evil presence, something that did not belong to this world. The sheriff and local police officers kept their distance, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to admit that they were as scared as I was. As the days passed, I delved deeper into the history of the village and its local legends. I discovered that Mackenzie Bridge had a dark reputation, with stories of unexplained disappearances and bizarre events dating back decades. Many of the older residents spoke in whispers of an ancient evil that inhabited the surrounding forest, something that should be left alone. However, the recent deaths were unlike anything that had ever happened there. The victims had no obvious connections to each other, but they were all found in similar circumstances, with the same circular mark around their bodies. It was as if something was hunting them, something that left no trace other than those burnt circles on the ground. The deeper I delved into the case, the more isolated I felt. The villagers were reserved, and those who dared to speak to me did so with a mixture of fear and distrust. Even the few who were willing to help seemed reluctant to share what they knew. It was as if there was a silent pact between them to protect Mackenzie Bridge's dark secret. So one night, when the full moon illuminated the landscape with a pale, ghostly glow, I decided to explore the forest alone. Something inside me said that the answers I was looking for were there, hidden among the shadows of the ancient trees. With my flashlight in hand, and the weight of my gun in my holster, I stepped into the darkness, determined to solve the mystery once and for all. I walked for hours, following trails that could barely be called paths, until I finally reached a clearing where the vegetation seemed to have been suppressed by an unknown force. In the center, I found what appeared to be an ancient altar, covered in moss and indecipherable marks carved into the stone. It was a place that exuded an oppressive energy, as if the evil that lived there was dormant, waiting to be awakened. It was then that I heard a sound that made the blood run cold in my veins. A whisper, low and guttural, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I spun around quickly, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all I saw were shadows dancing at the edges of my vision. Fear settled in me in a way I had never experienced before, a primal feeling that told me to run and never look back. But before I could make any move, I felt a presence behind me, a feeling of cold that paralyzed me, as if the very air around me had been drained of all life. Slowly I turned around, and what I saw made me question everything I believed to be real. Before me was a figure that defied all logic, something that did not belong to this world. His eyes, if you could call them that, were abysses of pure darkness, and his form was changeable, as if he were in constant flux between the material and the immaterial. And then, without warning, he lunged toward me, enveloping me in an icy embrace that drained my energy, as if he were sucking out my very soul. I fought with all my strength, but it was as if I was fighting death itself. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of distorted laughter echoing in my mind, a sound that haunts me to this day. I woke up in the hospital with doctors and nurses around me, saying that they found me unconscious in the forest, with no visible injuries but with signs of severe hypothermia. No one believed my story, and the case was quickly dismissed as another unsolved mystery. I returned to the big city, but Mackenzie Bridge never left me. That place, and whatever lived in its shadows, stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me question everything I knew about the world. And to this day, every night, before I sleep, I feel like I'm being watched, as if the evil I found in that village was still chasing me, waiting for the right moment to claim me once and for all. As I took photos from different angles, capturing every detail, I got closer to get a better look, but there were no visible marks on the skin that could explain the cause of death. It was as if life had simply disappeared from the body, without leaving any trace. However, something about the environment made me feel like there was more than met the eye at that moment. After completing the initial inspection, I approached the sheriff and asked, "Where are you taking the body for the autopsy?" hoping he wouldn't create any more problems. "It will be at the village morgue," he replied with a tone of resignation, handing me the address. His initial resistance seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a tense silence. Without another word, I got the address and left the place, taking the body with me. I drove to the morgue, an isolated and gloomy building, where the body would be prepared for autopsy. It wasn't a big or particularly modern place, but it did its job. Upon arrival, I prepared everything for the procedure, knowing that it would not be an easy job. There were a lot of strange elements that didn't make sense, and the feeling that something was wrong followed me like a shadow. I placed the corpse on the steel table and turned on the voice recorder as I always did when starting a procedure. Starting autopsy of a man of approximately 22 years old, with no visible wounds on the surface of the body. Proceeding to a detailed review, I began to document every detail. The young man's features were ordinary, nothing that caught the eye. I examined his hands for signs of defense, but found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no sign that he had tried to protect himself. Only the inexplicable circle of scorched earth at the crime scene kept spinning in my mind. As I turned my body, something made me stop. On the back of the young man's neck, right at the base of his skull, was a mark that he had not noticed before. A triangular scar, small but perfectly defined, as if it had been carved into his skin with surgical precision. It wasn't a fresh wound, but it looked almost artificial, as if it didn't belong to a human being. My pulse quickened as I took photos of the mark and documented it in my notes. I had never seen anything like this in my years of experience, and the feeling that this was not a normal case intensified. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the scar, trying to find an explanation. What did that mean? How had it gotten there? Nothing in the files I had reviewed before coming to the village mentioned anything similar. I decided to collect tissue samples from around the scar, as well as the dirt under the young man's fingernails. I needed to analyze everything in depth, but something told me that the answers I would find would not be easy to accept. I completed the autopsy without finding any other abnormalities in the body. There were no signs of poisoning, no fractures, nothing to explain how he had died. It was as if his life had suddenly been extinguished, leaving behind only that strange symbol on the back of his neck. I stored the body in the morgue's refrigerator, but the feeling of restlessness did not leave me. There was something that didn't make sense, something much bigger and darker than I could comprehend at that moment. I left the morgue with my stomach churning. I needed to rest, clear my mind, and think about what I had found. But as I drove back to the hotel, I couldn't stop wondering what that brand meant. I knew that what I had faced in that village had no logical explanation, and that reality was about to become much more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The next morning, I went to the police station to continue the investigation. I needed access to previous case files, looking for any clue that might help me understand what was happening. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a young officer, visibly nervous, who guided me to a small office where I was given the requested files. The documents were sparse, poorly organized, and contained few relevant details. As I reviewed the pages, the echo of conversations at the police station filled the air, but one of them caught my attention. A farmer says he found another body behind his property in the forest area. I heard someone say from another room. That sentence stuck in my mind like a gunshot. I immediately got up and left the office to get more details. The farmer, a rough-looking man with calloused hands, repeated his story to a pair of officers. I decided to intervene. "Tell me exactly where you found the body," I asked in a firm tone. The farmer, with a slightly trembling voice, began to describe the place. He spoke of a part of the forest where the trees seemed thicker, and the vegetation became almost impenetrable. He said he was checking a damaged fence when he found the body. It was another young man, and just like in the previous case, there was that strange circle of scorched earth around him. But this time, there was something more, something that made the farmer run back to his house and call the police immediately. With every word he said, the feeling that I was dealing with something much bigger than simple murders grew inside me. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. But instead of revealing a clear picture, the final picture was even more confusing and disturbing. As soon as the farmer finished his description, I thanked him and prepared to leave towards the site. First, however, I went back to my temporary room at the police station and organized the files, looking for something that could connect the previous cases to what was happening now. But no matter how much I looked, I couldn't find anything that could give me a clear answer. As I drove to the location indicated by the farmer, my mind was full of theories, each more terrifying than the last. What if what was killing these people wasn't something human? What if I was dealing with a force that was beyond comprehension? Something that couldn't be stopped by traditional methods. When I finally arrived at the scene was as disturbing as the farmer had described. The body was lying on its back, and the circle of scorched earth around it seemed even more pronounced than in the previous case. But what really caught my attention was the expression of pure terror on the young man's face. It was as if he had seen something so horrible that his heart simply stopped beating. With my flashlight in hand, I began to examine the body and the surrounding area. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues that could indicate what had happened. But when I got closer to look at the body more closely, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the back of the young man's head, in exactly the same place as in the first case, there was that triangular scar, the same brand, the same mystery. I took more photos and took more notes, but with each new detail I discovered, I felt like I was further from understanding what was really happening. It was as if each new clue only took me deeper into an abyss of uncertainty and fear. I returned to the morgue that night with my mind overwhelmed. I needed answers, but I knew I wouldn't find them easily. Before leaving the body in the refrigerator, I took one last look at that scar. Something inside me told me it was the key to solving the mystery. But how could I unlock its meaning? The days that followed were a mix of intense investigation and sleepless nights, always with the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to attack. And with each new detail I discovered, the truth became clearer and clearer. I was dealing with something that could not be explained by natural laws, something that was far beyond my understanding. In the end, what I found in that village was much more than a simple mystery. It was an encounter with the inexplicable, with the supernatural. And to this day, the marks of those dark days still haunt me, reminding me that there are things in this world that cannot be understood, only feared. A little surprised by my presence, The farmer nodded and indicated the exact location of the body. Without wasting any time, I decided to go directly to the crime scene. I quickly drove to the farmer's property, which was on the outskirts of the village, right where the forest began to swallow the land. It was an isolated place, where the presence of civilization seemed to disappear. Upon arrival, the farmer guided me to the edge of his property, where a small path led deeper into the dense forest. The path was full of fallen roots and branches, but the man knew the place well and took me directly to the body. The corpse was in a similar position to the young man found in the forest the day before, but what really caught my attention was the soil around it. Once again, the earth showed a strange, circular burn, as if something had generated extreme heat in a perfectly delimited area. However, the body did not have any visible burns. I grabbed my camera and started taking photos, documenting the scene from every angle. Something inside me pushed me to get even closer to the corpse. Remembering the mark I had found in the previous autopsy, I leaned over the body and, with a mixture of fear and certainty, turned his head to see the back of his head, and there it was again, that triangular mark, exactly like the other, etched into the skin like a sign that shouldn't exist. My heart started to beat faster. This was not a simple coincidence. The mark, the burns on the ground, everything pointed to something much more sinister and unknown. I gave the order to the officers present to lift the body, but as I took out my pocket watch to record the time, I noticed something unusual. The hands of the clock were spinning uncontrollably, as if an invisible force was manipulating them. A shiver ran down my spine as I took a small radiation meter from my briefcase. It wasn't standard procedure, but something in my gut told me I should do it. Upon turning on the device, the readings took my breath away. The radiation levels were alarmingly high, something completely out of the ordinary for a place like this. Without wasting a second, I began to follow the radiation trail, moving away from the body and deeper into the forest. The further I went, the stronger the signs became, until I finally reached a clearing in the middle of the trees. What I saw there was terrifying. The ground was covered in dead animals, completely burned, as if they had been incinerated alive by an invisible force. Birds, squirrels, and even a deer lay scattered about, their bodies charred and twisted in grotesque positions. The radiation meter kept beeping, indicating that this was the most critical point. I took photos of this new scene, feeling a mixture of horror and disbelief. This was not something that could be explained with logic or known science. Something terrifying was happening in Mackenzie Bridge, something not of this world. And now I had evidence that pointed to a truth that was beyond what anyone in that village or even in the FBI could imagine. After documenting the disturbing scene in the forest, I returned to the morgue with the body of the young man I had found. The feeling of uneasiness was growing inside me, but I knew I needed to keep a cool head. Arriving at the local morgue, that small, dingy building that looked like it had seen too much death, I prepared the body for autopsy, just as I had done with the other. I placed the corpse on the steel table and turned on the voice recorder. Starting autopsy of a young man, approximately 20 years old. There are no visible wounds on the surface of the body. I am proceeding with a detailed review, I began, my voice echoing in the oppressive silence of the morgue. The familiarity of the process contrasted with the strangeness of the case. As he examined the body, everything seemed to point to the same story. There were no signs of struggle, no fractures, no indication of poisoning. The body was intact, except for the triangular mark on the back of the head. A feeling of déjà vu came over me. It was as if I was reliving the previous autopsy, but with a different young man, in a different place. Every detail I discovered heightened the feeling that I was dealing with something much bigger than a simple murder. It felt like I was approaching a dark secret, something that couldn't be explained by traditional methods. With each step of the procedure, the strangeness of the situation intensified. I continued documenting every detail, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong never left me. Those triangular marks, the circular burns on the ground, the high levels of radiation, and now, the burned animals in the forest. All of this made up a picture that defied all logical explanations. When I finished the autopsy, I placed the body in the morgue refrigerator, but the feeling of discomfort remained. I felt like I was just scratching the surface of something much deeper and darker. It was as if a shadow was hanging over me, and with every step I took, that shadow became denser, more oppressive. I left the morgue that night with my stomach churning, I needed a rest, I needed to clear my mind, but I knew that the images of what I had seen in that clearing would haunt me for a long time. As I drove back to the hotel, I couldn't stop thinking about what those marks meant. They were the key to solving the mystery, but what was the secret they kept? Over the next few nights, I tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. I went back to the old files, revisited the crime scenes, talked to the few residents who were willing to talk. But the more I investigated, the more evident it became that I was dealing with something that surpassed the limits of human understanding. It was as if the village of Mackenzie Bridge was hiding an ancient secret, something that should not be unearthed. Reality, which previously seemed so solid, now seemed fragile and permeable. The lines between the possible and the impossible began to blur, and the truth I was unearthing was far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. In the end, what I found at Mackenzie Bridge was more than just a mystery. It was an encounter with the inexplicable, with the supernatural, something that left marks not only on the bodies I examined but also on my mind and soul. And even after leaving the village, those marks, both physical and psychological, continued to haunt me, reminding me that there are things in this world that simply cannot be understood, only feared. There were no signs of struggle, injuries, or any other visible explanation for the death. The skin was intact, with no bruises or fractures. However, when I turned my body to examine the back of my head, my breathing stopped for a moment. There was the same triangular mark that I had found on the previous corpse, engraved with the same precision, exactly at the base of the skull. My heart beat faster as I took photos and collected tissue samples. That mark could not be a mere coincidence. It was clear that something much bigger and more sinister was at play. I completed the autopsy without finding any other abnormalities in the body. The same signs as the first corpse, the same inexplicable death, and that mark that wouldn't leave my head. I knew that to understand what was happening, I needed to see the bodies of the previous victims. If they all had the same brand, that would mean I was dealing with something beyond understanding. With this new information in mind, I decided to face Sheriff Donner again. As there was no time to waste, I went to the police station and upon arriving found him in his office, leafing through some papers indifferently. When he saw me, he raised his head and gave me a look that couldn't hide his contempt. "I need to see the bodies of the previous victims," he said bluntly. The sheriff paused for a moment, and then with a smile that seemed full of disdain, he tipped his hat. "Good luck with that," he said with a tone laced with sarcasm. "You'll have to dig them up." Something in the tone of his voice made me even more uneasy. Then, when he turned to get up from his chair, I saw it. When he lowered his head to put his hat back on, a feeling of horror overcame me. On the back of the sheriff's neck, where the light from the office reflected dimly, was the same triangular mark that I had found on the bodies. A cold ran through my body, leaving me in shock. That mark, which shouldn't exist, was now visible on the man who was supposed to help me solve the case. Did he know what that mark meant? Was he somehow involved in all this? My thoughts ran over each other, looking for answers where there were none. I knew better than to show my surprise. I nodded slowly, trying to maintain my composure, and left the sheriff's office with a head full of questions and the knowledge that something much darker and more dangerous was happening at Mackenzie Bridge. Now, I was not only facing an unsolved mystery, but also a man who was somehow tied to it. It's been a few days since my last confrontation with Sheriff Donner. During that time, I never stopped thinking about the strange marks, the inexplicably dead bodies, and the eerie silence that enveloped everything in Mackenzie Bridge. I knew that to understand what was really happening, I needed to examine the bodies of the previous victims. Using some FBI contacts, I was able to get permission to exhume one of the bodies. The body belonged to a lone man, someone with no family or close acquaintances, which made authorization easier. The local cemetery was a bleak place, a desolate, overgrown lot, with ancient tombstones standing like mute witnesses of time. The exhumation was quick and silent. The gravediggers, aware of the gravity of the situation, worked efficiently. Once the coffin was removed from the earth, it remained closed while being transported to the local morgue. The morgue, that cold and dismal place where I had already spent too much time, now seemed even more oppressive. The assistants placed the coffin on the autopsy table, and when I was alone, I took a deep breath before opening it. I knew that what I would find inside could challenge everything I had seen so far. With an ominous creak, I opened the coffin, and what I saw inside left me speechless. The corpse that lay before me did not look human. The head was grotesquely deformed, disproportionately large and elongated, with a skull that extended beyond what would otherwise be natural. The body was thin and elongated, as if it had been stretched or deformed by some unknown force. The state of decomposition was advanced, which made the body even more disturbing. The skin, wrinkled and dry, barely clung to the bones, but what shocked me most was the deformity in the head. This wasn't normal. It wasn't something that could be explained by any medical condition that I knew of. With my hands shaking, I decided to turn my body over to examine the back of my head. When I turned him over, my worst fears were confirmed. There was the triangular mark, engraved with the same precision exactly at the base of the skull. My heart raced again and a wave of horror coursed through my body. That mark was not a simple detail. She was a symbol, a sign of something much bigger and more dangerous than anything I could have imagined. As I processed what I saw, I realized that this discovery changed everything. It wasn't just a murder case. Something much deeper, something that defied logic and reason, was happening at Mackenzie Bridge. And now I had proof. The deformity on the body, the triangular mark. All of this pointed to a truth that was beyond understanding. I knew I had to keep investigating, but with each step I took, the feeling that I was entering unknown and dangerous territory only increased. In the following days, I continued the search for answers, revisiting the cemetery, the police station, and talking to residents. Each clue, each new discovery led me to believe that something much bigger was at play, something that surpassed the limits of human understanding, something that perhaps should never be unearthed. What I found at Mackenzie Bridge was more than a mystery. It was a confrontation with the inexplicable, with the supernatural, and even after leaving the village, the scars of those experiences continued to haunt me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that cannot be understood, only feared. When examining the back of the body, I looked for the same triangular mark that I had found on the other corpses, but due to advanced decomposition, the skin was too deteriorated to reveal any clear signs. However, upon closer examination, I noticed something even stranger. A small hole at the base of the skull, exactly where I expected to find the mark. Driven by curiosity, I took tweezers and very carefully explored the hole. I felt something solid inside, and after a few moments of effort, I extracted what appeared to be a small, elongated artifact made of an unknown metal. The object was smooth, without inscriptions, and reflected the light in a peculiar way, almost as if it absorbed it. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I needed to preserve it. I placed the artifact in a sterile vial and sealed it carefully. My mind was spinning around the implications of that discovery. What was that object? How had it gotten there? And most importantly, what was his role in these people's deaths? I decided I needed to document everything immediately. I left the morgue to go to my vehicle and get my camera. The air outside was cold and charged with tension as I walked toward the car. Dusk enveloped the cemetery in deep shadows. Just when I reached the vehicle and reached to open the door, a deafening crash broke the silence of the night. Instinctively, I turned around and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The morgue had exploded into 1,000 pieces. A huge cloud of smoke and debris rose into the sky, and the echo of the explosion rang in my ears like a roar. For a moment I stood still, unable to process what had just happened. All the bodies, all the evidence I had gathered, were destroyed in an instant. All I had left was the small artifact I had found. It was the only evidence I managed to save. At that moment, I realized that someone, or something, was willing to do anything to hide the truth. I clutched the bottle in my pocket with determination. I still had a lead, and I didn't intend to give up. What I was facing at Mackenzie Bridge was out of this world, and now, more than ever, I was determined to discover the truth. With a confused mind, I immediately headed to my hotel. I needed to collect what was left of my investigation, review my notes, and plan my next move. But when I arrived, something else awaited me. The street in front of the hotel was full of activity. Fire trucks, police officers, and a crowd of onlookers gathered to see what was happening. I quickly approached one of the firefighters, his face illuminated by the vehicle's flashing lights. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice thick with concern. "There was a fire in one of the rooms," replied the firefighter, without taking his eyes off the building. "Fortunately, we were able to control it before it spread." A feeling of anguish came over me. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. Something inside me already knew the answer before it arrived, but the need to see it with my own eyes pushed me forward. When I reached the hallway where my room was, the smell of smoke was strong, and the walls were stained with soot. My bedroom door was open, hanging precariously on a broken hinge. What I saw left me cold. Everything was destroyed. My notes, my documents, everything had been consumed by fire. The blackened walls and rubble-strewn floor bore witness to a clear attempt to erase any trace of my investigation. There were no doubts left in my mind. The fire in the morgue, followed by the fire in my room, was not a simple coincidence. Someone or something was determined to make sure I didn't find out the truth. Knowing that he no longer had physical evidence, the only sensible option was to leave the village. With the determination of a man who knows he is at a disadvantage, I left Mackenzie Bridge behind. I knew the case wouldn't be solved, at least not in the way I expected, but I still had one thing left. A single piece of evidence that hadn't been destroyed. The small artifact I had found on the back of the deformed corpse's head. Back in the city, the first thing I did was send the artifact to a trusted laboratory for analysis. The following days were marked by a wait that seemed endless. Finally, I received the lab report. When I opened it, my eyes stopped on a line that seemed to scream at me from the page. The material from which the artifact is made does not correspond to any mineral existing on Earth. I felt my blood run cold. I already suspected that what I faced in that damned village was not from this world, but seeing it confirmed in a scientific report was something else. The mystery surrounding Mackenzie Bridge was bigger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. And now, although I had left the village behind, the feeling that something had followed me, that something was yet to be discovered, did not leave me. I kept the report in a safe place, knowing that one day the truth would come out. But for now, the only thing I could do was wait, aware that what I faced at Mackenzie Bridge was not of this world. And maybe, just maybe, there was something out there that didn't want this truth to come out. As I waited for events to unfold, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the artifact I had found was just the tip of the iceberg. With each passing day, the presence of that object became more unsettling. Even locked and kept in a safe place, I felt as if he had an invisible influence on me, a kind of energy that I couldn't explain. I decided I couldn't sit idly by and wait for something to happen. I needed to investigate further, understand what that artifact was, and what its connection was to the strange deaths in Mackenzie Bridge. To do this, I turned to some of my oldest contacts, experts in areas that most people would consider out of the ordinary. There was a professor at Miskatonic University, a man named Dr. Gabriel Hawthorne, known for his work with ancient artifacts and his willingness to explore theories that many mainstream academics considered absurd. I contacted him, and to my surprise, he agreed to meet me quickly. I arranged a trip to Arkham, where the university was located, and took the artifact with me, carefully packed. During the trip, the atmosphere seemed heavy, almost suffocating. It was as if the world around me was shrouded in a blanket of tension, and everything around me seemed tinged with an oppressive gray color. I knew I was approaching something important, but I also felt the danger was increasing. When I finally arrived at Miskatonic University, I was greeted by Dr. Hawthorne in his office, a room filled with old books, artifacts, and strange objects that he had collected over the years. The air inside felt thick, as if time itself had slowed down. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that seemed to penetrate my soul. "So, you found something really extraordinary from what you told me," he said, as I placed the artifact on his desk. "I don't even know how to begin to explain, Dr. Hawthorne," I replied, "but I am sure that this object does not belong to this world." He picked up the artifact carefully, examining it from every angle under the soft light of his desk lamp. After a few minutes of silence, he got up and went to a shelf, where he took out an old book, bound in leather and marked by time. The title was in a language I didn't recognize, but its pages were filled with illustrations and text that seemed to be from some arcane grimoire or treatise. "This book," he began, "was written by a scholar who believed in the existence of ancient civilizations that predate even the most remote ones we know. Civilizations that, according to him, had access to knowledge and technologies that today we would consider magic. This artifact," he paused, holding the object up toward the light, "seems to fit the descriptions of some of the objects he mentioned." I watched him, eager for more answers. "What does this mean? What exactly is this object?" Dr. Hawthorne sighed, his expression turning grim. "I can't say for sure, but I believe this artifact is a kind of key, or perhaps a communication tool. These objects were reportedly used to open portals or communicate with entities from other dimensions. What you found, my dear, may be a link to something that surpasses our understanding of the universe. A wave of cold ran through my body. His words resonated with everything I had experienced at Mackenzie Bridge. The marks on the bodies, the explosion in the morgue, the fire in my room, it all felt like part of something much bigger, something that I was beginning to realize might be better left alone. If this is true, Dr. Hawthorne, what should I do now? I asked, feeling the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. He was silent for a moment, reflecting. First, you need to protect yourself. If someone or something is trying to prevent this truth from being discovered, you are taking a big risk. Furthermore, we need to find out more about this object and what it actually does. I can't do this alone, but I know some people who can help us. Therefore, we decided to join forces to further investigate the origin of the artifact. Dr. Hawthorne put me in touch with a secret network of scholars and investigators who were dedicated to exploring the supernatural and the unexplainable. These individuals, spread across the world, had access to knowledge and resources that went beyond the ordinary, and were all interested in unraveling the mysteries of Mackenzie Bridge. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with this network, sending and receiving information, sharing theories and discoveries. Each new piece of information that emerged seemed to point in the same direction. Mackenzie Bridge was a convergence point for forces that surpassed reality as we know it, and the artifact I had found was the key to unlocking this enigma. But as we got deeper into the investigation, things started to get more dangerous. People involved in the case began to disappear, some inexplicably, and those who tried to get too close to the truth were found dead, in mysterious circumstances, similar to those of the victims at Mackenzie Bridge. I knew I was running out of time. The truth we were about to discover was as dangerous as it was vital, but at the same time, there was something inside me that said once we opened that door, there would be no going back. Finally, after weeks of preparation and research, a new clue emerged. One of the network's members, a historian specializing in ancient cultures, discovered references to a sacred site hidden deep in a remote forest that could be related to the artifact. This place, according to legend, was the entry point to a realm beyond our own, a place where the laws of physics did not apply, and where ancient entities patiently waited for the right moment to return. That's where I was supposed to go, accompanied by Dr. Hawthorne and some of the best experts on the network. We knew this journey would be dangerous, but we also knew it was our only chance to understand what was happening and, perhaps, to stop an unimaginable force from unleashing itself on our world. As we prepared the last details for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. It was as if the very air around us was charged with an invisible presence, a shadow that moved at the edge of our perception. On the day of departure, as we climbed the trail leading into the forest, a storm began to brew on the horizon. The wind howled through the trees, and the sky darkened with heavy clouds, almost as an omen of what was to come. With every step we took, the artifact in my pocket seemed to pulse, as if it was aware that we were approaching its final destination. And then, as we reached the heart of the forest, we saw what we were looking for, an ancient structure, covered in moss and vines, hidden from the world for centuries. It was there that everything would be revealed, and it was there that we would face the truth, whatever it was. As we advanced through the dense vegetation, the wind blew with increasing strength, as if the environment itself was trying to stop us. The structure in front of us, which looked like a combination of stone ruins and ancient wood, exuded an aura of mystery and danger. The walls were covered in moss and cracks, and time had clearly been merciless to this place. However, the atmosphere around it left no doubt that that building housed something much older and more powerful than any of us could imagine. Dr. Hawthorne led the group, holding a flashlight that cast dancing shadows on the overgrown walls. Behind him, the other team members, experts in various areas of the occult, followed in silence, aware that any out-of-place sound could be the last thing we heard. I was at the end of the line, with the artifact firmly tucked away in my pocket, feeling its weight not only physically but also psychologically. The feeling that it was beating, almost like a heart, continued to haunt me. As we approached the structure's entrance, we noticed symbols carved into the stones around the door. They were inscriptions in an ancient language, which none of us recognized immediately. Dr. Hawthorne stopped and passed his flashlight over the symbols, trying to decipher them. These inscriptions, "Don't look like anything I've ever seen," he muttered, more to himself than to us, but somehow it feels like they were made to keep us away. A warning, or perhaps a threat. The silence that followed his words was broken only by the distant sound of thunder. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I knew we couldn't back down now. "We should continue," I said, trying to inject some courage into my voice. "We need to find out what's here." Dr. Hawthorne nodded, and together we pushed against the heavy wooden door, which gave way with an agonizing creak. The smell of mold and damp earth flooded our senses as we entered the darkness. Hawthorne's lantern could barely illuminate the path in front of us, but we could see that the interior was even older and more decayed than the exterior suggested. There were narrow corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, and the walls were covered in more inscriptions and engravings, many of which depicted scenes that could only be described as apocalyptic. As we advanced, the air became denser, almost suffocating. It was as if the structure itself was living, breathing around us. Each step seemed to echo endlessly, creating a cacophony of sounds that made us nervous. The tension between us was palpable, but no one said a word. We knew we were getting closer to whatever the secret of this place was. Finally, the corridor opened into a large circular chamber, which appeared to have been carved out of rock. In the center of the chamber there was a stone altar, covered in symbols and inscriptions that glowed with a dim, unearthly light. Scattered around the altar were the remains of ancient sacrifices, human and animal bones, which had long since turned to dust, but still retained an aura of horror that made my stomach turn. "The artifact, this is where it should be used," said Dr. Hawthorne, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and fear. He approached the altar, extending his hand to me. "Let me see." Reluctantly, I took the artifact out of my pocket and handed it to him. The moment his hands touched the object, the chamber seemed to vibrate slightly, as if an invisible force was activating. The symbols on the altar began to glow more brightly, and a low, guttural sound echoed off the walls, as if the structure itself was awakening from a deep sleep. Hawthorne placed the artifact in a perfectly molded socket on the altar's surface. The moment the artifact settled, a burst of light ripped through the chamber, forcing us to cover our eyes. The ground shook violently, and the guttural sound turned into a deafening scream, as if thousands of voices were crying in unison. When the light finally dimmed, we opened our eyes to see that the altar had transformed. Now, in the center of it, there was a dark opening, a sort of portal that seemed to suck in all the light around it. An icy wind emanated from that black hole, and the feeling of danger was almost tangible. This is a portal," said one of the experts, his voice shaking. "But where does it lead?" Before we could respond, a figure began to emerge from the portal. It was not a physical being, but a shadow, an indistinct form that seemed to be composed of pure darkness. The presence of that entity brought with it a deadly cold, and I felt as if my very soul was being drained just by being in its presence. "Back off," shouted Hawthorne, trying to get us away from the altar, but it was too late. The entity moved with impossible speed, and in an instant, it was upon us. I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, and everything around me began to spin. It was as if time itself was being distorted, stretched and compressed by that force. Somehow I managed to pull away, stumbling backwards and falling to the cold floor of the chamber. I looked up in time to see the entity envelop them all in its shadows. The sound of their screams mixed with the roar of the portal, and a feeling of utter despair washed over me. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body felt paralyzed with terror. Forcing myself to move, I crawled towards the exit, feeling the ground shaking harder and harder. As I reached the hallway, I looked back one last time and saw that the entity was expanding, filling the chamber with its darkness. Dr. Hawthorne and the others had disappeared, swallowed by that force. With a racing heart and renewed determination, I ran down the hallway, the sound of the chamber collapsing echoing behind me. The entire structure seemed to be collapsing, as if it was being consumed by the same darkness it had released. Finally, I reached the entrance, throwing myself out just as the structure began to completely collapse. The ground beneath my feet shook, and a column of dust and debris rose into the sky as the ancient building disappeared in a cloud of rubble. Lying on the ground, panting and covered in dust, I looked up at the sky darkened by clouds and destruction. I had escaped, but barely, and although the artifact and its secrets were buried forever, I knew that the truth about Mackenzie Bridge and what I had found in that cursed village would never leave me. I stood up, feeling the weight of tiredness and loss, I had lost more than companions on that journey. I had lost part of my own humanity, my sense of reality, and as I walked away from what was left of the structure, a single question echoed in my mind. What did that entity really want? And scarier still, had she really been contained? Or just freed for a new purpose? The answers to these questions remained beyond my reach, but I knew my life would never be the same. Something was loose in the world, something that didn't belong there. And although I survived, I knew the fight was far from over. I slowly stood up, my body still shaking from what I had just experienced. The structure, now reduced to rubble, still exuded a sense of malevolence, as if the earth itself was permeated with the presence of that being we had unwittingly freed. The sky above me, darkened by clouds and dust kicked up by the destruction, seemed to reflect the inner chaos I felt. Every step I took away from that place was heavy, as if the air itself was thick with the echo of the voices that had been forever silenced in that chamber. As I walked through the forest, the reality of what had happened began to set in. I had lost colleagues, friends who shared with me the desire to unravel mysteries beyond human understanding. They were taken by a force that did not belong to this world, an entity whose purpose still eluded me. And even though I had survived, the feeling that something was still lurking, watching, waiting, was impossible to ignore. When I finally emerged from the forest and saw the road that would take me back to civilization, I felt momentary relief. But I soon realized that although I was physically safe, something inside me had changed forever. I was no longer the same man who had arrived at Mackenzie Bridge. Now I carried with me the weight of a secret I could never fully share, knowledge that separated me from the rest of the world. During the drive back to the city, my mind wandered to everything that had happened: the triangular mark on the back of the victims' heads, the metallic artifact that seemed to be from another world, and of course, the shadowy entity that emerged from the portal. It all seemed like part of a puzzle that I was just beginning to understand. Whatever that entity was, it did not belong in our reality, and its release could not be without consequences. Arriving in the city, I got in touch with the few allies I had left in the network of scholars and researchers. I reported everything that had happened, but I knew that none of them, no matter how brave or well-informed, could fully understand what we faced in that place. The truth is that deep down, I felt that we were dealing with something that could not be stopped or understood with academic knowledge or courage alone. The weeks that followed were marked by a feeling of constant restlessness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the darkness of that chamber, felt the deadly cold that emanated from the portal. Dr. Hawthorne's report, now lost forever, echoed in my mind, his cryptic words suggesting that the artifact was just a key, one part of something much larger and more dangerous. And even though it was far from Mackenzie Bridge, the feeling that the entity was still out there, perhaps watching, perhaps planning, was impossible to ignore. I knew that my life could not continue as before. I had seen things no one should see, and I carried with me the weight of knowledge that could not be erased. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just abandon this fight. Even if I didn't have all the answers, even if I was terrified of what might be lurking in the darkness, I had to keep investigating. I had to try to understand what was at stake. And so, my days turned into a tireless search for answers. I consulted more experts, scoured old libraries for forgotten texts, and kept in touch with the few who survived that journey to share theories and clues. But despite all my efforts, the truth continued to slip away, always beyond my reach, like a shadow in the periphery of vision. Deep down, I knew that the fight against the unknown was eternal, a battle that transcends time and space. The entity we released at Mackenzie Bridge was not the only one of its kind, and the triangular mark, the metallic artifact, were just fragments of a much larger mystery. But even so, I continued, because I knew that if I gave up, if I simply closed my eyes to what I had seen, I would be condemning others to face that same terror without any chance of defense. Today, looking back, I see that the Mackenzie Bridge experience taught me much more than I could have imagined. I learned that there are forces in this world and beyond that defy our understanding, that there are secrets that perhaps should never be revealed. But at the same time, I learned that as terrifying as the unknown is, it is our responsibility to face these horrors, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to try to keep the darkness at bay. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for following this story. What you just heard is more than just a narrative. It's a wake-up call, a a reminder that the world is a much stranger and more complex place than we imagine. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your participation is essential for me to continue bringing more stories like this. And of course, don't forget to share your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you thought, what you learned from this story, and what you think could have happened next. Your comments and reflections help me better understand what you, my listeners, are thinking and feeling. And who knows, together we can discover even more hidden secrets out there. Thank you very much for watching and see you in the next story.